You have to understand that the key motivation for getting soldiers to fight in Russia, as in any war, is in promising soldiers something in return for doing the fighting, for risking their lives, for making a huge sacrifice of some sort. And that might be honor, fame, glory, monetary rewards, as frequently works with Russia's army. But Russia's conscripts simply aren't meant to be. They're not primed to fight. They're offered very little in return for their service. And so suddenly they find themselves thrown into the breach, very little motivation, relatively little training, having expected to basically sit out their year of service doing some busybody work, maybe in the far east of Russia, manning a border post, maybe sitting on slightly closer to the front lines in Kursk. And that leaves us with a problem, because these are not going to be highly motivated soldiers. These are soldiers who, when we look back at Russian history, in particular, if we look at the wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya, may feel as they're easily beaten by a superior Ukrainian force, somewhat angry, shall we say, towards the president and towards the society that sent them there.
What risks do this new wave of conscripts dragged into the war through Kursk pose to the Kremlin?
Well, of course, we're in very early days. But let's look at the Afghan war as an example of what might happen. Now, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up or to overturn the communist government there and install their own communist government. And this was all heralded in a blaze of propaganda that is going to seem very familiar if you've been reading Russian narratives about the war recently. That is, it's a democratic mission, it's about supporting the local population, it's about law and justice, i.e. all these sort of high-flown values. But very rapidly, the Kremlin got drawn into a long and pretty awful conflict that they just couldn't win. And just like today, they needed to fill that space with more and more bodies. So they sent conscripts in. Conscripts who were part of a Soviet Union that was rapidly unraveling, who didn't see much value in fighting, who didn't really see the need for a war at all, and who certainly didn't get any rewards when they came home. They weren't fated as heroes. They weren't given the special benefits that, for example, their grandfathers had been when they came home from World War II. And what happened to this group of conscripts was that they felt sidelined by society, especially in the 1990s, as Russia collapsed in the post-Soviet era. And they basically became, not all of them, of course, but many of them, these young, traumatized, disappointed men became involved in criminality. In the criminal gangs, in the mafia, they rented themselves out as mercenaries and fanned out across the post-Soviet space and ended up everywhere from Belarus to Tajikistan, assisting authorities and the opposition as well in carrying out violent acts. And at home, of course, what they effectively were doing was perpetuating, if not quite a civil war, then forms of violence and forms of organized, forceful opposition that challenged state authority. And so one has to wonder, as the young men today who are struggling in Ukraine, who are committing violence in Ukraine, who are encouraged to commit violence in Ukraine with very little reward, begin to filter home, where will they end up?
Has there been any signs of reaction yet then from the conscripts themselves, especially in Kursk?
So what we have seen are streams of videos of conscripts surrendering en masse. They're just not willing to fight. Some, of course, are attempting to fight, but Kursk has essentially been given up without much of a battle. Right? The Ukrainians have found it on the whole pretty easy going. We've also seen on Russian social media spaces the release of videos from conscripts and from prisoners who are purportedly begging their mothers for help, addressing the president and asking for assistance, detailing bad conditions at the front and detailing also alleged violence conducted by the Ukrainian military. And I stress allegedly, because once again, we must imagine that the Kremlin may be flooding these spaces with its own fake videos in which it is the Ukrainian army that is conducting violence against conscripts rather than the Russian authorities' own incompetence at allowing Ukraine to invade part of its sovereign territory.
Obviously, the war being in Ukraine is largely fought, as you say, by these mobilized or contracted soldiers. How do they differ from the conscripts? And do they present their own threats as well to Putin?
Well, certainly they do. We might look back to an event that was so massive last year, but which we all seem to have all but forgotten, and that is the Prigozhin um, armed coup, mutiny, revolt, whatever you're going to call it. It's still not quite clear what he was hoping to achieve, in which he and a fairly large number of, albeit not Ministry of Defense contract soldiers, but men who were out there fighting for the money, marched on Moscow because they felt that the deal that they'd struck with the state had been broken. The pact that they had was somehow thrown away by the Kremlin. But what I would note there is that a much larger number of Wagner men, when they were asked by the Ministry of Defense simply to switch allegiances from Prigozhin to the ministry, did so because they were promised the same payday. The conscripts don't have that. What's the reward for them? And so, where are the tensions? Where are the frustrations bubbling up with that group of people?
Of course, these conscripts as well are only one part of the wider problem Putin faces in Kursk. With no sign yet that Ukraine's going to be forced out, what's the wider reaction to the Kursk incursion been in Russia?
It's been a very curious reaction because in the first few days, the Russian state was very keen to paint a picture that the nation was mobilizing on behalf of the afflicted residents, those who'd had to flee. And we saw lots and lots of videos of purportedly normal people gathering around, donating food, humanitarian supplies, working in their local community to help people. And we also saw what seemed like mostly pretty badly mocked up stories of columns of Russian tanks and Russian helicopters advancing on Kursk, about to cast the invaders out. And these were trumpeted across the propaganda channels from mainstream media to social media. But since those past first few days, everything's gone quiet. And it looks like the Kremlin is simply hoping to sweep this under the carpet and make everybody move on and forget about the problem altogether. And there is really very little evidence that Russian society as a whole is reacting particularly negatively. We haven't seen massive amounts of chatter or discomfort that a large chunk of the country has been invaded by its neighbor. The goals of the war to invade and denazify Ukraine, such as they were proclaimed by the Kremlin, have gone completely awry over the last 2.5 years. Instead, there is just this sense of keeping on, keeping on.
For more news on the war in Ukraine, early access to our videos, live streams, and members-only Q&As, sign up for a Times Radio membership at the link in the description. Goodbye.